Is that torn piece of paper part of the design?
Yes.
Okay, neat.
Okay, the audience is with us.
Good evening and welcome. We'll be starting the program momentarily. Good evening and welcome. We will be starting in just 1 minute. Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. Welcome to our first virtual program for the Lincoln Park Community Research Initiative. My name is Julie Ems, Director of Community Relations at DePaul University. The research initiative was founded during the DePaul Centennial year in 1999, and it continues to unite the university with the residents, community organizations, and businesses of Lincoln Park, where we share, document, and discuss the historic significance of all aspects of life in the community. Our committee members represent community members, the business community, and DePaul University. We are funded by the community for the community. Thank you to all of our supporters, both individuals and community organizations like Wrightwood Neighborhood Association and the Old Town Triangle Association. If you are not familiar with us, I will put our website up in the chat. For over 20 years, we have been bringing you programs 2 times a year, in the fall and the spring. For our spring program, we were planning it when COVID hit. And like so many, we had to put it on pause. We were hoping to be with you in person tonight for our fall program, but the virus has a different plan. We are so pleased to have 2 very talented writers join us in conversation tonight. Ben Austen and Audrey Petty, as they discuss high-risers, Cabrini-Green, and the fate of American public housing. Ben Austen's book, which is a sweeping exploration of race, class, popular culture, and politics in modern America that brilliantly considers what went wrong in our nation's effort to provide affordable housing to the poor and what we can learn from those mistakes. I would like to thank our independent bookstore partners, Unabridged, and Seminary Co-op, where I hope that many of you have purchased your copy of High Risers. And if you have not, I will share website information on how to purchase in the chat. Ben Austen and Audrey Petty. Ben Austen is a writer from Chicago. He is the author of High Risers, Cabrini-Green, and the Fate of American Public Housing, which was longlisted for the Andrew Carnegie Medal of Excellence in Nonfiction, shortlisted for the Goddard Riverside Stefan Russo Book Prize for Social Justice, and named one of the best books of 2018 by Booklist, Mother Jones, and the Public Libraries of Chicago and St. Louis. His feature writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Wired, GQ, The Best American Travel Writing, and many other publications. He is currently at work on a narrative nonfiction book about the parole system and the country's practices around crime and punishment. Audrey Petty is a writer and educator. She writes fiction, poetry, and creative nonfiction. Her stories have been published in such journals as African American Review, Story Quarterly, Callaloo, and the Massachusetts Review. Her poetry has been featured in Crab Orchard Review and Cimarron Review, and her essays have appeared in Savior, Color Lines, Columbia Journal, The Southern Review, Oxford American, Cornbread Nation 4, Gravy, and the Best Food Writing Anthology. She is the editor of High Rise Stories, Voices from Chicago Public Housing, Voice of Witness, McSweeney's, and co-editor of The Long Term by Haymarket Press. She has taught extensively in the fields of African American literature and creative writing, formerly on the faculty in the creative writing programs at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and Knox College, among other appointments. She currently directs the Sojourner Program, Scholars Program at Illinois Humanities. We will have a Q&A function this evening to allow our audience to ask questions. The Q&A is now open, and as Audrey, and we invite the audience to ask questions as Ben and Audrey join in their conversation. There is something I would like to bring up, and I'll say this again. There is a new option where you can upvote. So if there's a question that's being asked that you really would like us to ask, make sure that you click on the thumbs up icon next to the question. Those questions will then be automatically sorted by the number of votes and move to the top of the question queue. Audrey and Ben, welcome. I now turn it over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hey, Audrey.
Hey there, Ben. So great to be here with you today.
Yeah. I mean, I'll say that, you know, it means a lot to talk with you, and I'm thankful for Julie for that introduction. And I think both of us are about what institutions and how they think about the communities around them, so that this talk is meaningful in that way. That's exactly what this organization is doing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Julie. And Ben, I have to say, I read and loved your book when it was first published, and to read it for tonight was a revelation once again. It's a beautiful book. It's epic, it's intimate. It's intimate in the way it's epic. It's epic in the way that it's intimate. It's so complex and beautiful and so well crafted. I could talk the whole night about that.
Go ahead, yeah, come on.
But I know there are others here, and I thank you all for being here tonight and look forward to being in conversation with you as well. So to get started, I do have lots of questions, and I will keep an eye on the clock so that we share time generously with all who are gathered here. So Ben, of course, we know each other. We're both native Chicagoans. And to begin, I'm wondering if you could say something about that part of who you are, how that informed the way you came to this book, if there were certain questions or concerns that you had that led you into this project in the beginning.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Audrey. Thank you for all the nice words, of course, and for being a fellow traveler in all sorts of ways. Yeah, I mean, definitely that was a major part of working on this book. To think about this place, first Cabrini-Green, this kind of iconic place, this place that almost never was referred to without the qualifiers infamous or notorious. Mm-hmm. And to think when it was being torn down, like, what does that mean? You know, what history is happening? And for an outsider, someone like me, I'm a South Sider, not a North Sider, I'm white. I don't qualify for public housing. To think about that too, of sort of these received images. And then to kind of, you know, learn in the course of working on it, at least from my perspective, that it felt like the entire story of Chicago could be captured in those 70 acres between Chicago Avenue and a little past Division. That you could sort of see the whole story of this city from its origins, its politics, its industry, its in migration, its out migration, its in and out migration again, the sense of the role of the government, its race and class, architecture. It all felt there, and so it felt like a way to express that history, also to wrestle with some ideas of the city, and emotionally to kind of feel like, I think people who are committed to Chicago feel the great problems of the city, and yet your love is tempered with this kind of this pain, and so that was part of it too. To sort of feel that, and I mean, if people got to the end of the book, there's a person that I write about, JR, that sort of expresses that almost my own feelings at the end. He sort of is singing the praises of this broken city, and this love for it.
It comes through so powerfully. I think the ache, there's an ache, there's joy, there's grief, but I think that complicated love really holds the book together and is expressed by so many people that we meet in the book. You cover a wide span of history in this book, and there's a lot to talk about those early days and those 70 acres and what came before Cabrini on that land. I'm wondering if you could speak about the early days of public housing and the CHA, and what were some of the aims, what were the ambitions, what were the aims, what were the assumptions, how did the CHA sort of come out the gates, and what were they announcing and committing to as their initial goal?
So the CHA, the Chicago Housing Authority, which built and managed and was the landlord for public housing in Chicago, and getting federal funds to do it. That's a lot. I mean, I think about that area and all of its transformations. So to start with, there's this bigger question of like what was there before public housing, and that this was a different kind of working class and lower class area, and sort of thought of as notorious and infamous as both an Irish slum and as an Italian slum, and before it became an African-American, predominantly African-American lower income area. And that it was a place of industry, and that its industry is actually what made it an undesirable place to live, like, to live so close to the factories. But that they also provided jobs, and that's what brought people there. So that's one sense. And then, for people who know the city, just to walk that area now, where there used to be 23 high-rise public housing towers, close quartered, there's none of that anymore. And it's sort of been swallowed up by a kind of wealth of the near North Side. And so the story of like what the CHA was doing, I mean, you can look at the story of public housing in Chicago, and just, I'd say housing in Chicago is like almost the clearest line or expression of a kind of institutional racism, of a kind of injustice, that housing, at the same time that the city creates and the federal government creates public housing, it's also creating the government-backed home loan. And so people who couldn't afford or didn't have access to, in the free market, to housing, sort of had this other resource, which was a necessity. And for African Americans who were kind of restricted to the South Side, to what was called the Black Belt, they were restricted by racial covenants, which were neighborhoods that were refusing to sell to African American buyers. They were restricted by redlining, which is a legal practice where banks and the government refused to back loans in Black neighborhoods. And they were viewed by just kind of aggression and fear from moving into other neighborhoods. So public housing is kind of this, this antidote to that. It is really this effort by government, not just for African Americans, but for lower income people, that if you can't find a home in the private market, you can get this city or government supported housing that is so needed. It's really, I mean, people hear public housing now and they think of only pejorative, of negative things, but really what a resource to imagine. And at the same time, it's sort of poisoned by the same sort of racism and injustice. So where it's placed in mostly in existing areas and existing Black areas, it sort of puts in concrete the divisions in the city, the way that it's underfunded, the way that it's unkept, the way a lot of good intentions going bad of both the architecture, which doesn't fit in and sort of stigmatizes the communities, and the way that it's a victim of even the changing city. I mean, as the city becomes poor, as communities move out, as housing becomes less, the demand for it becomes less, even on the low end, and sort of these large developments become more vacant and more derelict. I'm not sure I answered your question entirely, but I said a lot.
No,
so.
you began to. There's so much in so much in the answers to pursue. This book is so full of life and so full of community and all kinds of people who belong or who are connected to Cabrini in some really fundamental way. There are four residents who we get to know very well throughout the book, and one of them I'm thinking of, Annie Ricks. As you were talking about who lived in near North area before Cabrini came up, and these migration patterns, these different communities who live there. Of course, I think so much with your book and with the work I did on High Rise Stories about the Great Migration and the promise of Chicago, the promise of public housing. And so I wonder if you could speak about Annie Ricks, for example, who's one of the people we get to know very well in your book, and the promise of public housing, the promise of Cabrini-Green for her.
Yeah, I mean, I'll leave in foreground that question, which I mean, what you're saying is something that what I tried to do in this book was to tell all those things that I said also through human stories, through people who experienced it, and which also meant that people let me into their lives to tell their stories. So Annie Ricks lived on the west side of Chicago. She was a mother of many children, and she worked, she rented a home, and the house caught fire, or somebody set it on fire. She thinks that it was arson. And so suddenly she found herself homeless, like literally homeless, and it baffled her. She was somebody who took care of her children, who worked, who provided. And she found herself doubling up in relatives' homes, with all of her children. And then she found herself sometimes walking to Cook County Hospital and with her kids trying to sleep in the lobby there. This was, it was completely foreign to her. And so she started to apply to public housing. And it was a time in the late 80s when public housing already was this stigma, in some ways at its nadir, at its worst. For her, it represented a room's home, a roof over her head. And so one of the places she applied was Cabrini-Green, and she actually walks there. I mean, you talk about migration. Like, she takes this kind of trail of tears almost from the west side with one of her sons, and she demands a place. And at that point, it's ridiculous. Like, they say they don't have any vacant units, but that's because the CHA had stopped preparing units that went vacant for more occupancy. So they were about 50% vacant, and just apartments boarded up or people living in them illegally. And so they told her they didn't have any vacancies. She demanded one, and they eventually gave her one. And you know, one of the perplexing and powerful things about writing this book and engaging with people there is, for all of the even the trauma that people experience and the difficulties, a great affection, a love of home that people felt. And when demolition was starting in the 90s and going through the 2000s, many people didn't want to leave, and that baffled outsiders. You know, this place that you've only heard awful things about. Why do you want to stay there? This is an opportunity. But this was a place this was home, and there was a sense of community there, which was complicated. I mean, even you could know everyone, and you could also know people who might do you harm. Mm-hmm. But there was a sense of knowing a place.
Mm-hmm. And Ben, remind me, did Annie Ricks, did she cross the Ogden Bridge to arrive at Cabrini that first time?
Yeah, right behind 1230 North Burling. I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, since this is about Lincoln Park. You know, that thinking about just architecture as meaning. In the 60s, a group of Lincoln Park concerned residents, you know, generally concerned about crime and property value and how to make their neighborhood better, petitioned the city to stop the Ogden Avenue Bridge, which extended all the way from the west side pretty much to the lake, and to sort of cut it off and to change the remainder of going east of Ogden and to make it disappear so that it could be walkways and so on. And the city did that. And in some ways, it was a neighborhood's efforts to, and you know, this is a time of urban renewal, to think of how to remake their neighborhood, which was successful, and you know, to cut themselves off by where they felt crime was coming from. Mm-hmm. And that happened. I mean, it's a really powerful sort of divide. And I think, you know, certainly from the Cabrini-Green perspective of people who experience that, to feel a sense of isolation, that these are the expected boundaries, mm-hmm. of where you're allowed to, you know, peacefully to move.
Then you've spoken so powerfully about stigma, about the infamous, about the ways that Cabrini-Green was iconic for so many who had never been there. And this is something that really, there's a thread all the way through your book that really kind of troubles this. And I'm wondering if you can speak about this issue of sort of the myth, the mythological and the real, the ways these things intersect, and also the ways that they have consequences. You know, there are these pop cultural references to Cabrini-Green, whether it's the Times or the movie Coolie High or the horror movie Candyman. I know there's been music videos, and of course, decades of headline news about tragic occurrences at Cabrini-Green. And so it's, yeah, I think I'm interested in the ways you reflect on this infamy, and also what kinds of things did residents share with you about these representations and the ways that they made sense of them or thought about them?
Yeah. I mean, that's, I'm imagining some of our viewers today, and that residents of Lincoln Park, when we talk about sort of the myth and the reality, I'm imagining many people, if they're older, have had very real experiences with Cabrini-Green, and maybe some positive ones and some very negative. That, you know, crime is so closely tied to income and to age, right? So that people who commit crimes are generally between whatever, 16 and 25, 29, and lower income people. And this was this community of extremely low income with an overrepresentation of children, of young people, of juveniles, of young people. And so that reality, and which is so tied to the myth. I'm thinking of a story that I'll tell real quickly. Julia Stash, who ran the MacArthur Foundation and was Mayor Daley's chief of staff when he was the second Mayor Daley, when he was figuring out how to tear down all the public housing high rises in Chicago. And then Julia Stash moves to the MacArthur Foundation and funds it. And she told me this story as a reporter, so I'll repeat it. And I'm pretty sure I remember it accurately. She was driving down Clybourne on the way to the Loop. You know, this is this great shortcut, and, you know, going to go by Cabrini-Green, these big boulevards. And someone jumped into her car at a stoplight, a black man, who's assuming from Cabrini-Green. And he has in his hand a bag, a paper bag, and I think she thinks it's a weapon. And she ends up crashing the car and jumping out. Police come, the guy gets out and runs. Her husband comes and tells her, you know, never go by this area again, which she decides that this is never a route that she's going to take. And later they find that the bag is still in the seat of the car and there's a sandwich in it. And all of the things that this story represents to me, like what you did, that question, the reality that somebody jumped in her car, that really happened. He wasn't like in there to eat the sandwich. The sense of the worst, right? That you know, even beyond what was in front of her, that what's in the bag must be a gun. And the consequences, I will never go by this place again. You know, like that to me somehow, when you asked that question, I thought of that story. That's from the, you know, the surrounding neighborhood, right? So then you asked the question about experiencing it internally too. That you're such a mediated place, you're so representative. I mean, one of the crazy things about Cabrini-Green is that it became, you know, nationally known as sort of this sort of horror kind of symbol of like the worst of the inner city, and internationally known. And you know, that it's just one place in Chicago. And even among the public housing developments, it didn't have the highest incidence of crime. It wasn't the biggest. It wasn't even the poorest, but it had all of those. You know, it didn't have the so, you know, much of its representation is built on its location. That in segregated Chicago, this place happened to be built on the north side. It's the only large black settlement outside the west side and the south side of the city. And so that's an interesting kind of phenomenon to sort of create this place of danger that builds in the imagination. And you can imagine even, you know, that, you know, talking to media people, that this is where it was, the story was seen much closer. And once you start telling that story, then it becomes the story itself. I remember a reporter telling me about a shooting in 1990, that there was like a triple murder on the south side and a shooting in Cabrini, and his editor said, "That's Cabrini-Green, get over there." And it just meant something different. Yeah, Candyman. Candyman is this horror movie. There's another one being made, if people don't know, that it's supposed to come out. But this idea of like the public housing as this monstrous place. It comes out in 1991, right? I think that's right. And it really captures that moment in time of like both the fear of the inner city and that it's suddenly a place that's rapidly gentrifying, that it's a place of shared, you know, that people, like the era of white flight is kind of coming to an end. 1990 is the first time that the city's population ticks up in 40 years. White population is growing. Those neighborhoods, you know, around Cabrini-Green are suddenly gentrifying. River North is being developed, for instance. And so that kind of tension sort of creates a public imagination of it too. And definitely has real life consequences. I mean, I think about, you know, in the criminal justice world, which we both work in as well, that how extreme cases become, you know, set the standards for extreme cases that aren't even representative set the standards for laws that then, you know, lead to things like mandatory minimum sentences, truth in sentencing laws, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Class X felony, as we have here in Illinois. Was that all over the place? Do you want to ask that differently?
No. It's just thank you. I have so many follow-up questions. I also want to make sure we talk about how, at least begin to talk about this moment where there is no more Cabrini-Green and the plan for transformation. And I mean, there's so much that I want to ask about Dolores Wilson and the work that she did in like collective action and collectivity at Cabrini-Green. And I think that's something that is revealed again and again in so many layers in the book. I wonder if you could speak to how Cabrini fit into sort of the larger city landscape, the national landscape when it came to its closure, its demolitions, the plan for transformation itself.
Yeah. Starting in the 90s, there was suddenly this push from the federal government to tear down public housing. It would be funded. Cities could get funding if they tore down high-rise public housing and replaced it with something, and something that wasn't high-rise. And you know, it became mixed income was the thing. And so there were millions of dollars to get from the federal government. The plan was called Hope 6 from Housing and Urban Development, and so there was this push to do demolition. And one of the ironies is that when you talk about collective action, like Cabrini-Green residents ended up suing the city and the federal government and saying that this would be, you know, moving us without that what displacement would suddenly would violate their rights. And so the most infamous public housing becomes the last to be torn down. Mm-hmm. And it was because of, you know, asking for guarantees. And if people are curious, there's still a stretch of row houses that are being developed, and that residents are deeply involved in the process of what's going to go there. And that's not because, I'll say it is because the residents sort of tied the hands of the city and ensure that they would have some you know, a number of them would be able to return to the community, that they'd be mixed in, that whatever was built there would include some proportion of residents of lower income. Otherwise, there would be very little there. And then that's what happened in the other developments, except for one other in Chicago, which there was also a lawsuit. This was on the near west side, the Henry Horner homes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. She would have been a good woman if there was someone there to shoot her every day of her life. That's what I think of those lawsuits. Mm-hmm. You know, like no one's going to do it out of the goodness of their sense of justice or housing rights or you know, part of that demolition. I mean, like, so you know, it was successful in the sense that if you were thinking about the neighborhoods as reducing crime and encouraging investment and you know, starting more businesses. Mm-hmm. You know, like, you know, you could look at that area. What could be more of a success? Mm-hmm. From the standpoint of the need for affordable housing. Mm-hmm. And for the needs of the low-income residents who are there, it's a disaster. Yeah. Well, Ben, I have to ask how you reflect on this history today, in this moment of pandemic, where there's so many Americans who are houseless, who are without shelter, who may be on the cusp of eviction. We're also in this moment of political transition, one way or another. How? Just one way. Don't even bring that up the other way. One way. I'm with you there. We're like, you know, there's something about the pandemic has thrown into relief, you know, all of the inequalities in the city. Mm-hmm. And so we are possibly on the cusp of like just an eviction crisis where people who are out of work can't pay their rent. And there's been a moratorium on evictions, but that moratorium didn't send any funds to either the renters or the landlords to pay their mortgage. So what's going to happen at the end of December when suddenly this is lifted? So to imagine that, and it does raise all these questions that are in the book and that you and I think about when we explore these issues, like what's the role of government to ensure that there's some equality, that our system of capitalism works in some ways for all. And it is, I don't think about, public housing is one form of creating homes for people who need them, but it's really just a way, it's a way to think about that the much larger need of affordable housing, which, in the city before the pandemic, it was like, we were like 130,000 units short. I don't even know what the number is now. I don't think they're reported. I also think that, like, Cabrini-Green was so visceral and visual and known, that public housing meant that we, the taxpayers, the citizens, literally own that property, right? The city was the landlord. And it was also in our landscape that is, less so in the near north side, but everywhere else, it defined the landscape. It was really like the only towers around, or one of the few. You could always tell in Chicago where on the horizon where public housing was. And so the issues we all were grappling with in some ways, and maybe in bad ways too, but they felt like they were front and center.
Yeah.
And I went through 100 years of newspaper stories. I could tell you that the city, was obsessed with this, and now they're so much less visible. Yeah. And that the city isn't grappling with them in the same way, and that suffering and inequality are a little, are much less visible, even if they're greater.
Well, thank you very much, Audrey and Ben, for sharing those wonderful stories. They really tug at the heartstrings, and really you can envision what happens. We do have a number of questions from our audience, so thank you very much for putting your questions in the Q&A. This upvoting is really working here, so please go into the Q&A and vote for your favorite question and make sure it gets asked. Our first question is by Alan Mellis. What is your opinion of the redevelopment of the former Cabrini-Green site?
Yeah, I mean, you could answer too, Audrey, but I think what I said, that, like, on that one hand, that area, if you're concerned only about a neighborhood, which I remember Mayor Daley saying, we're going to rebuild the souls of the people who live there, but we're also going to rebuild these areas. Yeah. And that the two of those were actually at odds with one another in many cases. That an area where you remove most of the former residents who were lower income clearly thrives in some way, but it doesn't reimagine how to integrate people together. Now there is some mixed income housing, and I think it's kind of a success. I mean, and I think it's a powerful idea. I'll say that, like, the plan for transformation, which was the city's big endeavor to tear down all of the high-rise units, it claimed that the mixed income would be the cure-all. And just by design, it's really for a tiny percentage of people relative to what public housing served. So it's not a solution in that sense. So I think at Cabrini-Green, there's something like that area might have 1,200 public housing residents now mixed in, where before it had like 10 times that many, way more than that.
Our next question comes from one of our committee members, Ted Robleski. You did a wonderful job profiling the people who resided in Cabrini. How did you gain the trust of those people so you could get them to open up to you, so you could get so much insight into their lives?
Yeah, I mean, Audrey, you did the same work. What do you think?
It took time. It took relationships. for High Rise Stories, it was about a 3-year process of being in conversation with people. Ben, I'm wondering, with all of the interviews you did and the research, how can you talk about how, I know that's deep work because it manifests in the depth of the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you just said, like gaining trust is, you know, especially a neighborhood like Cabrini-Green, why, you know, which was so covered in the news. And, you know, one of the amazing things, you know, people I interviewed, I can go back into old Tribunes or Sun Times and find them interviewed at some point 30 years earlier because, you know, the media was hanging around Cabrini-Green. Why should they trust me? Why should they trust people for the portrayals they've seen over and over again of Cabrini-Green? You know, winning trust also means just coming back over and over again and showing that you're not interested in the quick hit, you know, the sound bite, but something deeper. People used to say, I mean, some people said to me when I first showed up, either you must want to hear the story of the dead body on the elevator. I heard that all the time. You probably did too. Mm-hmm. Or they said the opposite, which was like, we were all a community, we were family, we knew everybody. Mm-hmm. So both of those could be true, and they also don't capture the truth of a place. So like you got to hear those stories on the polls, and then you got to like hear all the other stories, and that takes a lot of time. Mm-hmm. And hopefully in that time, that's winning trust. I mean, that's saying, you know, you can demonstrate that almost by the questions you're asking.
Our next question comes from Jay Tremblay. Why is there such a gap between the Chicago public housing approach, arguably the greatest public housing failure of my generation, and the New York one, arguably a success and a sustained and sustainable one? Yeah.
I mean, the first thing I'll say is that actually it's true that they've sort of, you know, lasted 20, 30 years longer, but New York is in crisis now. They're like, you know, $30 billion in deficit, and the buildings are falling apart. But he's right that it was a much greater success. And some of the reasons are part of the architecture, then they make sense. That there is no stigma to live in a high-rise development in New York City. And people sure know how to manage, you know, high-rise apartment buildings. And there's also such demand that mixed income almost happens naturally. And there were also efforts in New York City to integrate that. And so those really created a different kind of place. The funding problems now are almost beyond repair. So I don't know what's going to happen, but that's part of the answer. All three of those things that I said about New York didn't exist in Chicago. And also, man, our corruption here is different. Like New York City has these protections on civil servants and politicians because they know that corruption is there. If there weren't those breaks, it would be awful. And you know, we had this guy Charles Schweibel who ran public housing for decades and used it as a kind of piggy bank to build things. And you know, I think there is a kind of, when I talked about loving this broken place, that's one area where it's really broken. And so the mismanagement here was worse than in other cities.
So a question by Lawrence Greenberg, why didn't public housing succeed? Having resided as a child in a project in New York City, the idea was for people to stay a few years, get themselves together socially and financially, and then move out to be replaced by deserving, needing, mostly young families.
Yeah, I mean first thing I'll say is there's still 1 million units of public housing in America. So to imagine it as a failure isn't quite right. You know, we have this image of like the high rise and of Cabrini-Green, but there's still 1 million units that are being occupied, and there are many more Section 8 vouchers, housing choice vouchers. That idea of, you know, live there for a while, you know, get your feet under you and move out, sort of this, almost like this kind of dream of America, the American dream. It also just, you know, doesn't quite materialize. Like, what if there is no next rung up the ladder? What happens when all the factory jobs disappear and we become a service economy? And you actually can't afford you still can't afford, even if you're working, the housing on the private market. That idea of like how temporary it was never resolved even in the formation stages of public housing. It was always controversial and difficult. And there were always problems with how to, like, whether you evicted residents when their incomes got too high, and how do you keep racial quotas. It's a concept that we like to think of, and it's an ideal and it's a good one, but in practice, it's always been difficult. And we saw the same thing with the sort of dismantling of welfare as we know it in 1990s by President Clinton, that you hope that you could just be on this subsidy, this entitlement for a few years, but what happens next if you haven't progressed?
How would you compare Cabrini-Green to other North Side projects, such as Lathrop Homes, Marshall Field Homes?
Yeah. The others are much smaller. So Lathrop was also relatively successful in that its demolition was very problematic and fought incredibly hard, because if your belief is mixed income, the area where it is, like that small pocket of housing, how could that not be mixed income when all the resources that you would expect for the residents engulfed it? But sort of the idea that there shouldn't even be any pocket of 100% public housing sort of took hold. So I think scale is something. Marshall Fields Gardens and Apartments started out as lower income, but actually privately run, and it's still there on Sedgwick. And there's another very small public housing development over there too, known locally as the Orange Doors. Yeah, I think, but sort of conceptually, they were part of the same idea.
Shifting a little bit to, we were talking about some of those projects are small. What is your take on the Lincoln Yards project? You knew you would be asked that one.
I mean, it feels like the kind of free-form development that, that it's being subsidized in different ways doesn't really make sense. And part of a system that isn't really just, if you ask me. I mean, one of the things I think about a lot, like that people despise subsidies so much, right? And it's not just those on the right who still rail against it. And, this was part of the same rhetoric of the last election, but people in the middle and even on the left, the question that was just asked, like this should be temporary and then you move on. But that people with resources who believe that sort of like their own success is created by their own, abilities, like, we're subsidized by the government in so much as well. Like, the amount of money the government spends still, even with, changes to the tax law under Trump that goes to mortgage interest reductions, is still several fold the amount that goes to the entire budget for HUD. I heard the senator from Tennessee the other day. This is getting far afield of Lincoln Yards, but I'm going to say it. This senator from Tennessee, Marsha Blackburn, said the other day that she wasn't going to support any money for people during the pandemic because she didn't want to fund cities like Chicago and San Francisco, and those being code words for like Black people in Chicago and socialists in San Francisco. And it turns out that Tennessee, her state, is one of the leaders in getting more from the federal government than it gives back in taxes. And that's just, to not see that, to not wrestle with that and what it means is sort of, stuck in our inability to think the good that government can do, even if government is flawed. There's still so much that we need to expect from government. And we actually don't hold the private sector to the same standards. Like people who suddenly dismiss the federal government as, failed enterprises. We're never going to do that again. Never another Cabrini-Green. we don't think about these disasters like the housing crisis of 2007, 2008, and say we're never going to fund these banks again. We actually like go right back to it.
Right. So when you're talking about the geographic distribution of the former residents of Cabrini-Green, where did they go?
Yeah. Do you know as well, Audrey?
I know you know better than I. You know better than I do, Ben, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, all over. So some stayed, a lot went to the south side and west side. Like, so the thing about a Section 8 voucher is, gives some money from the federal government so you can go on your own to pay a landlord, is both the amount that you get, so where you can afford a place and which landlords would take you, turned out to be in neighborhoods that were segregated and largely lower income. So people went from this idea that we were going to sort of abolish concentrated poverty by tearing down the high-rise projects, that people went to concentrated poverty, but in other neighborhoods and in largely Black neighborhoods. And some people also left the city. You know, that we have an out-migration of African Americans. You know, we've lost about 200,000 in the last 20 years, and that's a huge number. And this is part of that exodus.
And, you know, growing up in the south suburb, I believe that some of the folks did come to our community as well. I remember that being a big, there was definitely some people who were unhappy and some people who were happy for it. So they definitely were very, very dispersed. And I think it's challenging that they were accepted into some of these communities, or maybe perhaps not accepted in other communities.
You know, the remaking of the south suburbs is a fascinating, you know, part of when you think about migration stories that happened, and sort of, you know, sort of recreated some of the same migration patterns that happened 50 years earlier in Chicago.
Right. I'm curious, what role did churches, the Catholic Church, Protestant pastors, play in assisting public housing residents?
Hugely in the Cabrini-Green neighborhood, and still do. I mean, those churches, even without their, this is also shows the love of community. The number of people that come back every Sunday to the neighborhood, to these tiny little churches, and, you know, keep them going. Dolores Wilson, who I write about, who is now in her 90s and shouldn't be going anywhere, especially during a pandemic, and who moved to a rehab public housing development on the south side. So that also happened. That question about where did people go? People went to other public housing developments that were deemed okay to have 100% public housing, that weren't in areas that were desirable, like Cabrini-Green. But that Dolores Wilson comes back most Sundays to go to her little church on Larrabee. And so, you know, they play a major role. They play a major role in all sorts of things. I mean, from getting people off drugs to keeping the peace, to helping people with school, to doing after-school programs, to getting jobs. I mean, this has continued still. There's this great organization, I mean, that some people on this call may know about, called Near North Unity Program. And so it's about connecting the different stakeholders in the community. It's run from one of the church, and church leaders are a major part of it.
We're going to close out with two final questions. Both your books are wonderful. I'm wondering how each of you thinks these two books complement and or contradict each other.
You go first. You say all the negative stuff. That's
I think they only complement each other. And I'm not just saying that. I think that they are very different in approach. So High Rise Stories is an oral history, and it features the voices of 12 narrators who lived in public housing from all over the city, high rises that don't exist anymore. So stories are told through the voices of those residents, those former residents. It's really rereading Ben's book has been such a pleasure, in that I have learned so much. There are people who we know in common, like Mrs. Wilson, who I hold very dear and who I rediscover through reading Ben's book. I think that both books, emerge, I think, from a love of the city, of a concern for residents. I think also from grappling with the complexities and the brokenness of our politics and our system. So I do think that they're kindred books for sure.
Yeah, people don't know Audrey's book is an oral history. So it's really, direct to the residents. They speak their own voice. And there's a kind of boldness and confidence in that, which I'm not sure I have, in the sense of like, I want to tell so many stories and I'm worried, did I tell the story about Charles Schweibel or the alderman or Jesse White, or, what about that other kid, And so, people probably could tell from even the way I'm talking now, this compulsion to sort of like fill in of all of like the context. And I think there's a trust that you have, Audrey, in knowing that the purity of the voice conveys the meaning that I think, I'm always kind of like fighting against. And I know there's a lot of advantages to doing that too. But there's also a clarity that you provide that's beautiful.
Well, thank you, Ben.
Time for our final question, and it comes from our very own Alderman, Michelle Smith. How did Cabrini-Green residents feel about their wealthier white residents across North Avenue? We are so close to each other and yet so remote. Even today, our high school struggles to help the kids who come from Monier and Jenner to reach the level of academic excellence as to those who come from the schools in Lincoln Park. This is not right. What suggestions do you have to bridge this divide?
Yeah. I mean, I was talking about some of the sort of structural changes that happened to the neighborhood, that at some point, North Avenue is actually extended. It's widened to like that gulf that the alderman is talking about is actually made bigger. And then many of the houses on the north side of North Avenue, the buildings don't have an opening, or their doors don't open up onto North Avenue. They turn inward to the north-south street. And like, it's a kind of protective, like, almost like crouching protection. I mean, residents, I think, one of the amazing things about that people would talk about of being there is that they didn't feel isolated from the city in a way. People tell these stories of having selling newspapers in the morning on Michigan Avenue, of walking to Lincoln Park Zoo, of feeling connected to this world around them, which is so different. And, I think also seeing in your face, immediately such grave and great differences and advantages. It's right there. As far as solutions, I mean, I brought up that group Near North Unity program, like it really is doing that work in some way that the alderman is describing. And, that there certainly are ways that schools and elementary schools, can work together. That I remember one of the programs at 5 elementary schools from the areas were sort of, seeing how their kids could interact and those kinds of things where the boundaries were overcome. The more of those, the better. But the economic divides are real in the sense of like, how do you structurally change those? It helps when we raise the minimum wage finally to 15, so that everyone sort of has a better living wage. Policies that support areas more certainly help. As people might also know, like the alderman mentioned the school Jenner combined with a school on the Gold Coast, and sort of all those divides sort of were both like eclipsed and also made more apparent too. But like where the resources, also a fear of being overcome, of being overtaken from people in the neighborhood. So there is that reticence as well, that there a suspicion that's proven, that there's just cause for it.
Well, thank you to both Ben and Audrey for joining us this evening in conversation. Hearing your passionate views of public housing and bringing to life those who have lived it and lived through it is really enlightened all of us tonight. And of course, there are definitely more questions that we could answer this evening and given in this virtual environment. But thank you to all the audience for joining us this evening and asking such wonderful questions. We hope that you will join us next time. And at the end of this webinar, we ask that you please fill out the event survey. See you soon. Yeah. Have a wonderful holiday season.
Thanks everyone for attending. Thank you, Julie. Thanks, audience.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Audrey.